The ground in Lone County, Alabama, doesn't just hold roots, it holds secrets that have been screaming to be let out for nearly 2 centuries. On the night of March 14, 1849, the sky over Hanville turned a bruised purple as the county courthouse was swallowed by a roaring inferno. The official report called it an accident, an overturned lamp, a tragic loss of records. But fire has a way of peeling back the skin of a lie. When the embers cooled, investigators found 3 sets of human remains in the basement. They weren't just trapped, they were chained to iron rings hammered deep into the stone. Every deed, every marriage certificate, and every probate record from the Sutton estate burned that night. But the whispers of the descendants could not be silenced. This isn't just a story about a fire. It's a story about the Bell River Plantation, 2 sisters who moved like a single shadow, and the man they bought to save their empire. Until the blood in their veins turned to poison, the legal trap set by Colonel Nathaniel Sutton was a masterpiece of post-mortem cruelty, a dead hand, will designed to govern from the grave. He knew his daughters better than they knew themselves, recognizing that their unnatural, mirrored bond was a shield against the world he had built. By crafting a document that tethered their massive inheritance to the requirements of marriage and procreation, he sought to shatter their insular world and force them into traditional submission. This was not a gift of wealth, but a leash meant to pull them back into the patriarchal order they had spent their lives quietly despising. The sisters stood in the mahogany, scented air of the study, realizing that their father's final act was an attempt to overwrite their very identities with his own twisted vision. Every line of the probate document felt like a physical weight pressing down on the 2 women as they sat in the silence of the main house. The colonel had specifically mandated that any potential husbands be approved by his hand-picked executors, men who shared his rigid views on racial purity and social standing. This was a calculated move to ensure that Sarah and Catherine could not simply find men of convenience to bypass his strict stipulations. The 24-month clock began ticking the moment the ink dried on the official death certificate, creating a suffocating atmosphere of urgency. They were wealthy beyond measure, yet they were effectively prisoners of a timeline that demanded they surrender their bodies to the service of an estate. The psychological warfare embedded in the inheritance was clear. The colonel believed that the sisters would eventually turn on one another when faced with the loss of their status. He had observed their private language and their shared glances for years, viewing their sisterly devotion as a biological defect that needed to be purged through the rigors of motherhood. By making the bequest conditional upon legitimate offspring, he was essentially turning their wombs into assets of the Bell River Plantation. The cruelty lay in the fact that they had been educated to think like men of power, only to be told that their only path to keeping that power was through the most traditional of feminine burdens. It was a labyrinth of his making, with no visible exit that did not involve their total surrender. As the sisters pored over the details with Jeremiah Osgood, the weight of the potential loss began to sharpen their resolve into something dangerous. If they failed to meet the demands by February 1849, the white, columned house and the sprawling fields of black earth would be sold to the highest bidder at a public auction. This meant the loss of their home, their protection, and the secret laboratory of records that their father had spent decades compiling. To lose Bell River was to be cast out into a world that saw them as nothing more than property themselves. Given their mother's status, they understood that the dead hand wasn't just reaching for their future, It was threatening to drag them back into the darkness of the very slave cabins they oversaw. The twins eventually found themselves sitting in the colonel's leather chair, the same one where his body had turned cold, looking at the maps of their kingdom. They realized that the will was a test of the very superior intellect their father had claimed to breed into them through his meticulous domestic engineering. If they were truly his masterpieces, they would have to find a way to navigate the maze without triggering the traps he had hidden in the legal prose. The inheritance trap was the catalyst for their descent into a much darker strategy, one that involved a level of manipulation the colonel never anticipated. They decided right then that they would satisfy the letter of the law while setting fire to its spirit, ensuring that the Sutton bloodline continued on their own terms. The colonel's library was a mausoleum of twisted intellect, filled with leather-bound journals that detailed the horrific intersection of agriculture and human biology. He viewed the Bell River Plantation as a closed ecosystem, a laboratory where the laws of nature were secondary to his own god-like delusions of grandeur. To Nathaniel Sutton, the people he owned were no different from the prize cattle he bred for the Montgomery fairs, categorized by physical traits and temperamental resilience. Sarah and Catherine grew up watching him pace the hallways with a calipers and a ledger, recording the growth of children with a chilling, clinical detachment. This eugenics obsession was the air they breathed, a toxic philosophy that suggested humanity could be perfected through the cold, calculated manipulation of bloodlines and breeding. Their childhood was a bizarre experiment in isolation, designed to prove that environment and education could refine a person while the law kept them firmly in place. The colonel treated his daughters as his most successful specimens, providing them with tutors and fine silks to see if a Gentile bearing could be engineered from the ground up. They were taught to read Greek and solve complex calculus, but only within the confines of a house that functioned more like a high-end kennel than a home. He would often measure their skulls or track their reaction times, treating their developmental milestones as data points for his correspondence with medical societies in Philadelphia. They were never allowed to forget that their existence was a project, a fragile bridge between his racial theories and the reality of his own hidden desires. In the slave quarters, this obsession manifested as a systematic nightmare of forced pairings and the cruel separation of families based on physical suitability. The colonel kept meticulous breeding logs that documented the ancestry of every enslaved soul on his land, seeking to create a workforce that was as aesthetically pleasing as it was physically robust. He was obsessed with the concept of uncommonly fair complexions, a trait he tracked through 3 generations with the same fervor a jeweler uses to inspect a diamond. This wasn't just about labor. It was about a desperate pseudo-scientific quest to control the very essence of human life and reproduction. The sisters watched from the veranda as their father played God, deciding which lives were worth cultivating and which were destined to be discarded in the next auction. The twins developed their own defensive mechanism against this scrutiny, turning into a singular, impenetrable unit that mirrored the colonel's own coldness back at him. They learned to hide their true thoughts in a secret language of gestures, ensuring that while their father measured their bodies, he could never truly map their minds. They saw how he treated their mother, Ruth, as a vessel for his experiments rather than a woman with a soul, and that realization hardened their hearts into diamonds. They became experts in his own methods, studying his journals in the dead of night to understand the mechanics of his control so they could one day dismantle it. The house was a quiet battlefield where the Science of the father was being slowly mastered by the daughters he viewed as mere trophies. By the time they reached adulthood, the sisters were fluent in the language of dehumanization, a skill they would eventually use to secure their own survival after his death. They understood the nuances of the breeding program better than the overseer, Jonas Pritchett, noticing the subtle ways the enslaved population resisted their father's biological directives. They saw women using forbidden herbs to prevent the births the colonel demanded, an act of rebellion that was invisible to a man who saw only data and never human will. This environment of absolute control and scientific cruelty didn't just break the sisters, it forged them into predators who knew exactly how to manipulate the biological variables of their own lives. They were his greatest achievement and his most dangerous failure, a pair of mirrors reflecting a monster's darkest dreams. The arrival of Marcus at Bell River was not a matter of chance, but the result of a calculated hunt through the human marketplaces of Hanville. Sarah and Catherine did not look for a man with the calloused hands of a field worker or the bowed head of the broken. They sought a mind that could match their own. Standing on the edge of the auction block, Marcus possessed a quiet, dangerous literacy that sent a ripple of unease through the crowds of traditional planters. While the men around them saw a liability, an educated slave who might forge passes or read abolitionist papers, the sisters saw the missing piece of their inheritance puzzle. They watched him with the same clinical detachment their father had once used, recognizing that his intellect was the only tool sharp enough to cut through the will's restrictions. The bidding for Marcus was a theater of excess that signaled the twins' departure from the established norms of Alabama's planter class. They allowed their overseer, Pritchett, to drive the price far beyond the market value of a typical house servant, signaling their desperation and their resolve. Every $100 increase was a strike against the memory of their father, a declaration that they would spend his fortune to subvert his final wishes. The merchant from Montgomery eventually folded, unable to justify the cost of a man who looked his masters in the eye with such unnerving clarity. When the gavel finally fell, the sisters had secured a man whose primary value lay not in the strength of his back, but in the depth of his secrets. Once Marcus was brought within the heavy oak doors of the plantation house, the traditional hierarchy of Bell River began to quietly dissolve. He was not sent to the crowded, smoky cabins in the quarters, but was instead installed in the shadow of the colonel's vast, forbidden library. The sisters treated him with a terrifying kind of respect, providing him with clean clothes and proper meals, as if he were a guest in a gilded prison. They needed him to be sharp, his mind unclouded by the exhaustion of the fields, so that he could navigate the complex legal and biological landscape they occupied. This strategic elevation was a gamble, a move that placed a weapon in the hands of the very man they intended to use as a biological surrogate. The conversation in the study that first night was a collision of three minds that had all been shaped by the colonel's cruelty in different ways. Sarah laid out the terms of their arrangement with a cold, rhythmic precision that left no room for the typical pretenses of the master-slave relationship. They didn't ask for his loyalty, they demanded his participation in a pact that would satisfy the legitimate offspring clause of their father's testament. Marcus listened with the stillness of a predator, realizing that these women were not offering him freedom, but a different kind of bondage wrapped in silk. He understood that he was being bought to be a ghost in the machine, a silent partner in a conspiracy that would leave him either a king or a corpse. By the end of his first week, Marcus had become the invisible axis upon which the entire Sutton estate began to turn. He spent his hours cataloging the Conal's breeding logs, finding the flaws and the hidden resistances that the sisters had missed in their initial grief. The sisters watched him from the doorways, their deep green and midnight blue dresses rustling like dry leaves against the polished floorboards. They had successfully introduced a new variable into their father's laboratory, one that was designed to fulfill the will while keeping the outsiders at bay. Yet, in the silence of the main house, a new tension began to grow, as they realized that Marcus was not just a tool to be used, but a man who was learning the architecture of their own fears. The shadow pact began in the flickering amber light of the library, where the three of them rewrote the laws of Bell River. Sarah and Catherine sat across from Marcus, their shared gaze creating a wall of emerald and sapphire that no outsider could ever hope to penetrate. They didn't speak of love or marriage, but of biological necessity and the cold mechanics of fulfilling a dead man's ultimatum. Marcus was presented with the Conal's own meticulous logs, the very blueprints of his oppression, and told to use them as a map for their collective survival. It was a transaction of the most intimate and horrific kind, where the currency was the future bloodline of the Sutton name. The house became a fortress of secrets, its heavy doors locked against a world that expected these women to be victims of their own inheritance. Every interaction within the main house was choreographed to maintain a veneer of normalcy, while the underlying reality twisted into something unrecognizable. While the neighbors in Hanville gossiped about the eccentric twins and their handsome house servant, a darker domestic ritual was taking place behind the velvet curtains. Marcus was given the keys to the plantation's inner workings, moving through the rooms not as a ghost, but as an architect of the sisters' grand design. They shared their meals in a silence that was thick with the weight of their mutual conspiracy, each bite a reminder of the high stakes they were playing for. The overseer Pritchett was kept at a distance, his mechanical precision no longer needed in a house that was now governed by a much more complex and private set of rules. The arrangement required a level of psychological endurance that tested the sisters' lifelong bond and Marcus's own sense of self-preservation. Sarah and Catherine took turns meeting with Marcus in the study, using the Conal's medical texts as a guide for their orchestrated attempts at conception. There was no warmth in these encounters, only a clinical determination to beat the 24-month clock that was counting down to their financial ruin. They viewed their bodies as the final battlefield of the Creek War veterans' legacy, determined to win even if it meant sacrificing their own humanity. Marcus, for his part, played his role with a stoic intelligence, recording every date and detail in a hidden journal that would one day serve as his ultimate insurance policy. As the months passed, the air in the plantation house grew heavy with the physical manifestation of their secret pact and the growing tension of their shared life. The twins began to retreat further into their own private world, their identical movements becoming even more synchronized as the reality of their situation took hold. They watched each other for signs of the success their father had demanded, their fingers interlaced in a desperate grip whenever they were alone. Marcus was the silent observer of this slow descent into madness, the only person who truly understood the cost of the freedom they were trying to buy. The house felt as though it were breathing with them, its walls absorbing the whispers of a plan that was as brilliant as it was deeply and irrevocably broken. The secret arrangements eventually bore fruit, but the victory brought a new and terrifying kind of isolation to the women of Bell River. When the first signs of pregnancy appeared, It was not a moment of joy, but a signal that the final phase of their war had officially begun. They had satisfied the biological requirement of the will, but they had done so by inviting a permanent, living witness into the very heart of their kingdom. The pact had transformed Marcus from a tool into a partner, a shift in power that the sisters had not fully calculated in their initial desperation. As their bodies changed, so did the dynamic of the house, turning the gilded cage into a laboratory where the experimental subjects were now the masters themselves. The reckoning of 1849 arrived not with a whimper of submission, but with a roar of flame that consumed the very foundations of Loudoun County's legal history. The courthouse fire was a calculated erasure, a desperate attempt to incinerate the paper trail of a lineage that had become too tangled to survive the light of day. As the clock struck midnight on March 14th, the sky over Hanville was choked with the charred remains of property deeds, and the colonels meticulously kept probate records. The twins stood miles away at the edge of the Bell River woods, watching the distant orange glow with the same cold detachment they had practiced since birth. They believed that by burning the records of their father's will, they could finally step out from the shadow of his biological mandates. Yet, the fire could only destroy the paper. It could not touch the physical evidence of the horrors they had hidden beneath their own floorboards. When the local investigators finally picked through the cooling ashes of the basement, they discovered the 3 sets of remains that would haunt Alabama folklore for generations. These were not the bodies of victims of the fire, but prisoners of a much older and more intimate conflict that had reached its breaking point. The iron rings embedded in the stone walls told a story of a captivity that had shifted from the psychological to the literal as the sisters' sanity began to fracture. They had spent years trying to control the variables of their lives, only to end up chaining the truth to the very earth their father had worshipped. The sight of those skeletons, still bound in their final moments of agony, served as a gruesome monument to the failure of the colonel's social engineering. It was the physical manifestation of a dead hand, that had finally closed its cold, skeletal fingers around the throats of the living. The local community struggled to reconcile the image of the elegant Sutton sisters with the terrifying evidence of the basement's secret history of chains and shadows. For over a century, the families of Loudoun County would whisper about the final months at Bell River, where the silence had grown so thick it eventually choked the life out of the house. People remembered the way Marcus had looked during his final sighting, a man who carried the weight of 1,000 secrets in the set of his shoulders. The official story of an overturned lamp was a convenient lie designed to protect the reputations of the wealthy planters who feared what the truth might reveal. If the Sutton sisters were capable of such calculated depravity, it suggested that the entire social order of the South was built upon a foundation of madness. The fire was supposed to be an end, but it was merely the beginning of a haunting that would never truly find peace. The truth about the twin daughters and the man they shared remained buried in the mud until the unsealing of the abolitionist testimonies in the mid-20th century. These documents, smuggled north by Marcus before his final disappearance, provided a clinical and devastating account of the biological war that had been waged at Bell River. They detailed the precise moments the sisters realized they could no longer look at one another without seeing the reflection of their father's monstrous ambitions. The testimonies painted a picture of a household where the language of glances had turned into a weapon of mutual destruction, fueled by the children they had birthed. Marcus had documented the descent with the precision of the bookkeeper he was, ensuring that even if he perished, his masters would never truly escape their own history. He turned the colonel's methods against the family, using the power of the written word to anchor their names to the dark earth forever. Today, the ruins of Bell River Plantation are nothing more than a warning etched into the landscape, a place where the black cotton soil refused to grow anything but weeds. The story of From Chimneys, who shared a man to save an empire, remains a chilling reminder that power bought with the blood of others always demands a final, horrific payment. The fire of 1849 did not cleanse the land. It merely cauterized a wound that continues to bleed through the oral histories of those who remember the liturgy of fear. We are left with the image of two women in green and blue, standing in a burning house of their own making, realizing too late that they had become the very monsters they sought to outsmart. Their legacy is not one of wealth or survival, but of the iron rings that still remain in the mind's eye of those who study the dark corners of the past. The sisters thought they were escaping a prison, but they had only succeeded in building a much deeper grave for the Sutton name.